So Juan, so were you involved with this project as a research assistant? Is that?
Well, I was involved with Joe in several projects. We were doing mapping cultural Austin back in those days, and somehow that project anchored many of the questions that then Joe addressed in the book in terms of how audiences interact in very specific way with content. And I was really in that moment when we were doing this project, I really didn't grasp what this project actually was entailing in terms of understanding how media offer particular content and how audiences based on a multi-layer of identities make choices.
Right.
So, and in this particular project in Texas, in terms of Austin, show this very complex history of a multi-layer identity where, in the case of Latinos, Spanish speaking, English speaking, or bilingual with different generational status and stories set up a very different kind of layout of options of how do they consume media that complicate the idea that Latinos or either only watch telenovelas or Spanish language media, or they don't do that because they only watch English language media. Right? So in that sense, clearly Joe was already setting the stage for a more complex discussion in terms of media choices. Right?
So did you do any of the interviews?
Yes, I did. I did several interviews with people with three generations. The idea was to talk about with the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter. And that was a really interesting conversation because it was about the immigrant stories. It was about education. It was about how do they get to work, what is their aspirations, and in that context, how do they see media or consume media, right? Yeah, and there was very different stories. It depends on the family, depending when they arrived, if they were legal or undocumented, that inform different decisions, right? In that sense, to me, it was quite revealing to see how audiences may have different resources to use different media. Let me give you an example. One of the very interesting cases were people that they weren't able to read, right? So they weren't able to read, so television was a key, a core element to anchor the reality. But there are other people that they were, but remember the mother that she was not able to read, she really pushed her daughters and son to go to school in a more really powerful way than other families. So ironically here, her daughters and son actually achieved kind of like school degrees rather than other families that maybe didn't have that, that they have the capacity to
the lack of educational capital.
Exactly. So in that sense, talks a lot about this idea of a structuration that Joe brings about, of how people do things with the resources that they have. So surprisingly, you may expect somebody that doesn't have the education, then the causal result would be, well, then the son and daughter, they are not going to be educated. But that was basically the contrary, because she was so aware of her disadvantage that actually pushed the family to look for cultural capital in order to advance, because she knew what was at stake in that decision, right?
Okay, that's interesting. So as graduate students, you didn't have a sense of that like big scope.
Exactly. So it was very interesting in many ways. So to me, what Joe was doing in that moment, because the project of Joe, the larger project so was TV, right? And TV as this big media that has different levels of layers of how to study, right? This kind of a structural, industrial, legal, technological media that has this power, right? So how to get around the structural element that she pretty much actually, he pretty much worked on, but to how to get around with thinking about the artists, to go to the artists and to see how the artists actually have particular resources to see context and to relate with media.
But I think he does come on the side of the structuration a little more strongly. And I think that is one of his very kind of important contributions, I think, to the discipline, because he's able to speak to audiences and the very multi-layered identities they have, but he's constantly bringing the structural forces to bear upon that multiplicity in some very important ways. And
I mean, I think, rereading the book, one of the things that struck me is, so the book came out in 2007, and I'm guessing most of the research happened like the decade before that, right? Like in the 80s and 90s. So really before YouTube, streaming television, right? But I feel like the sort of concepts, the basic concepts he lays out about the relationship between audiences and producers, while not being able to speak entirely to the moment that we're in now, are really theoretically interesting, right? I mean, he's writing in this moment, before we are getting, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and, all these YouTube channels and all these audiences as producers. And, and I think, but the arguments that he's making about the relationship between producers and audiences, I think are still really informative. I was, I was thinking about it through that frame, right? Because I'm working on that East Los High project, and so the whole time I'm kind of reading the book to get ready for this conversation, I'm thinking about that project, and I'm like, oh wow, this is actually, while it may not be completely explanatory of the way that digital television production is happening, is still really informative and in these interesting ways, right? Because he talks about globalization and localization in the context of Brazil. And and I'm thinking, I think about a show like East Los High, and that's like, okay, so they're taking that Mexican education, the educational Mexican telenovela genre, translating it to an extremely local context in East Los Angeles that then is globally compelling. And to me, I was like, like thinking through thinking through his argument in that context, to me was, really mind-boggling. I mean, I think it's really, in that sense, just really shows the power of what he lays out, that, in today's media environment, it's still, I think it's still a very productive,
relevant.
Really relevant, still very productive text to thinking through the new television production environment that we're living through now.
We were talking about the way in which Joe's work really is very interesting, because nowadays people talk about digital or some new media form that has emerged, and somehow that we need to kind of rethink everything all over. But as you said, the framework that he has, where he's talking about media are simultaneously national, regional, global, or the way in which audiences are inhabiting multiple cultural contexts, I think as a framework that applies, as you said, to almost anything, whether we talk about contemporary, or one could even argue they apply even more today than they would in the past to like a television program, where when he was writing, we didn't have all these multiple formats for TV. But I think this framework then in a way applies even more now.
I think so. It has the potential to, in my sense of it, right? Because here, you have like if I think about the East Los High, a very locally specific show that, I mean, I don't know, the woman who produced it came out of the New School in New York and was very informed by Henry Jenkins. But, I wonder if she read Joe's work as well, because, to me, it's like, it's so local and specific. And, when he talks about cultural, is it the cultural context or?
Cultural proximity.
Yeah, cultural proximity. It's all about cultural proximity, right? They call it authenticity, but it's really cultural proximity. And, but that cultural proximity, and it's obviously informed, and the audiences love it because it is like the telenovelas they grew up with, right? Even if they're second or third generation, they all are familiar with those those telenovelas. And so, so for me, as I was, kind of rereading the text, I'm like, wow, like it's totally relevant. His work is totally relevant to thinking through the moment we're in.
I guess I would say Joe's work is very extensive in many ways, and he has this very ambitious project of global TV and explaining the evolution of the technology, the industries at local, regional, national levels. He makes a really good effort to try to be comprehensive and to try to draw some reflections about the complexity of that evolution. But there are two things that I found key here in terms of the current discussion is his introduction, the idea of asymmetrical interdependency, right? He's fighting back the idea of a cultural, the dependency theory, the idea that these hierarchical powers put some countries fatally in a position of defenders, right? So they are the disadvantaged, right? So this idea that actually big countries require the smaller ones in order to grow in a particular way, even though it's asymmetrical, it requires. And so I feel that in the digital landscape, even though in the moment of Netflix or Facebook or Hulu or Google, you see that interdependence happening in real time now with particular industries needing to be taken into account at national level, even in the face of the Netflix dominance. So they need to work from local markets to basically address the local culture because they cannot override culture. So in the one hand you have the bigger picture about power in terms of the structure that is asymmetrical, but in the other hand you have culture, the idea of cultural proximity and the iteration of cultural proximity that brings the local as a really powerful engine of attraction is important, but also the idea that the local doesn't mean necessarily not all the time the national or a local. So it's something that appeals to audiences even in multiple registers. So maybe, as he said, a rural audience in Brazil has most to do with the rural audience in Mexico than the rural audience in Brazil with the city in Brazil, right? So he complicates the notion of culture in terms of that proximity. And I think that is also really relevant in the digital moment. Because young people feel that they can reach the world, and they can, right? But what do they pay attention to? That talks about what kind of register of cultural proximity do they feel that they can reach in other parts of the world, right? So we are seeing a new wave of connections through culture, right? That are not necessarily local, but they are ingrained in local experiences, right? At multi-local levels, right?
So Richard, I was, as a historian, I guess I was wondering, your read of the book.
Yeah, I was just thinking that in terms of what struck me the most was the relationship, or the way he describes the relationship between producers and audiences. And I found that it was kind of breathing new life into encoding, decoding. But then at the same time still putting that within the bigger structure that he lays out in terms of the relationship between structure and culture. And still putting that within that context. And I think I found that most interesting, and I think he does a really good job at not just looking at producers and audiences in terms of that relationship, but kind of diffusing what that could mean, particularly when we're addressing the digital age, because there are multiple producers and there are multiple audiences, and our audiences are the producers and producers are the audiences. So in this odd way, he's both calling back to these older notions of encoding, decoding, while at the same time allowing us to build on that and look at the digital age. So I was really struck by that.
And I think one of the things I really appreciate about Joe's work is, he's focused on an area that he has really been studying for a long time. And in that sense, he wants to engage with it very deeply, so that there are transformations. And like you said, they are very important. Digital does mean something very different. But I think to not get carried away by the contemporary moment or whatever it is that is fashionable, but to kind of engage with it in a sustained way, I think is very essential. And I think the book really provides us that insight. So one of the things that I've found Joe's work to be most useful on is that, which is he's always connecting things to the core ideas that he has developed. So cultural proximity, for example. In this book, he has taken the critiques of cultural proximity that other scholars have kind of made sometimes to him and in other writings, and he kind of has made that a multi-layered thing, right? So he talks about cultural proximity, genre proximity, linguistics, so that there are ways in which perhaps now with the digital moment, the proximity is not just a question of culture, but maybe it is genre, it's region. So he's able to enrich the conversation by enriching the concept without getting away from it. And I really appreciate that because oftentimes I think in our contemporary kind of conversations, we just kind of go with the most recent, which is important because that's what the audiences are engaging with. But then to historicize, contextualize, and then to provide some depth based on a larger sustained engagement with the topic, I find very, very productive.
So in that sense, he brings the idea of complexity theory and the idea of structuration. So I found really interesting this talk about cultural proximity that is complicated, that is not necessarily the national culture. It can be local, it can be translocal, it can be, there's different, and it can have different registers of proximity based on different vectors of identity. Maybe my proximity talks to me in terms of being a Latino, or in terms of being gay, or in terms of being young people, or in terms of there's different registers where you may feel that somebody talks to you in a way that you agree on or that you are interested. But also the fact that complicates the thing that is this industrial relationship. So when he talks about audiences and producers, he brings a reality that is industrial. So even in the digital moment, when people are producers and consumers, somehow they see themselves in a kind of an industrial way because they want to be known, they want to share, they want to have there's the reminiscence of that industrial construction. So in the context of your work, he actually acknowledged the fact that cultural proximity, or to me, can be an industrial product in and of itself.
Right.
So it's not we're not talking about only about a culture that seems to be pure in the local or original. No, sometimes even our ideas of the local are framed through industrial manufacturing of the local by the mediation moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So people sometimes see things that feel familiar because already the mediated possibility of that cultural representation is some sort of an industrial project of that visuality. Does that make sense? So in that sense, culture became problematized by the fact that it's mediated. In this case, on television, we're talking about industrial product that has particular rules, that has particular possibilities, right? So then this thing about culture and the structure of the industry, this technological, that is legal, it really brings a very, very interesting and fertile land to talk about what's going on in the digital moment now, right? How we understand that proximity being built from prosumers, right? So how we understand the battle of fighting back the overarching presence of Netflix or Facebook or so to me his work is still relevant in that sense. In that moment of structuration, how people do things with the resources that they have.
Right.
It's just the audience has given been the resources. Before they didn't have them, so they have them now. What they are doing with them.
Right. I mean, I guess that would be one of the interesting things to, because I know he's still doing work in Brazil, so it would have been interesting to talk to Joe about the ways that, I think digital technologies have lowered the cost of production and the impact that may be having on local production, and then the relationship of how perhaps those, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see,
I think his current work is on Netflix in Latin America.
It is, okay,
okay. I think that would...
So he's already on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. He's already on it.
Interesting because we're talking about Latin America, right? So we cannot go away from the fact that still TV in the traditional form is very relevant. Even though things are changed and video on demand is taking over, right? But still the tension is very, because those traditional industries are actually tapping on the video on demand market and also in the digital market. So the corporate extension of television are there. So you have this huge fight between original content producers, big networks, and the telecom industry and the Silicon Valley. So what you see in Latin America is this huge battle between the power of the new digital sector and the power of the traditional cultural sector that produces media, that is TV. And this power is interesting and complicated at the same time. So you have Netflix reigning over them, but you have the rise of Globoplay in Brazil as main concentrator of aggregator of audiences, and you have the rise of Blim from Mexico, that is kind of the Netflix for Mexicans, that actually has become the second most rated window in Latin America. When this is kind of interesting. When Blim appeared, everybody was making fun of that because it was Blim, the telenovelas against House of Cards, against Orange is the New Black. So there was this idea of the elites to say, like, how can you compare one thing to the other? But the dismissal overlooked the fact that people still watch particular cultural forms they were not offered in Netflix. So now Blim is the second biggest. Of course, Amazon is getting into the mix and many other. But then you have the national pushing back against the global, and culture allowed that battle to be fought and not to be lost fatally, right?
Right. I guess, one of the things that, and I know it's not necessarily Joe's project, right? And in the sense of, it's not one of the things that he has focused on, empirically or theoretically over time. But especially since you worked on the project, I'm curious to hear how it was worked through. So, and you get a little bit into this towards the end, where he's talking more about gender and race and relationship to other identities. But in the context of telenovelas, I think gender is so important, and gender and sexuality is so important. And in the context of Brazil, especially, and this could also be indicative of the time in which the research was done for this book, but race and Afro-Brazilian identity has become such, and connected to class, has become such a, so I guess I'm wondering, in that sense, as a research assistant working on this project, what were some of the discussions around those issues?
Well, actually, Joe was cognizant of the fact of the racial dynamics happening in Brazil, and he has worked on that in terms of the Afro-Brazilian identity in television, and he has acknowledged that. So, Latin America in terms of race is a space that has been embraced the idea of mestizaje, right?
Right.
So, but under the idea of mestizaje, the idea of racism assuming it was erased, because assuming race doesn't matter. And that is the ideology of the nation building ideology back to Latin America. And Brazil was called itself a racial democracy, right?
Racial democracy.
But in fact, the reality is that color matters in Latin America. So
and the spaces he did research in, right? Salvador Bahia is very Afro-Brazilian,
Yeah. He thought that he's not cognizant of that, and I guess he was working on that, and those vectors of identity. When we're talking about multiple identity, right? He was cognizant of that. I guess timing. He was really trying to work in the whole span of decades of how the cycle of technology worked in order to make a bigger point about how tables turn around.
Like, the macro.
Yeah, from exactly that. That took a big part of the book, and explaining why we're coming from one-way flow from the U.S. imperial moment to a different moment where actually there are the emerging markets everywhere. So I guess that was the one efforts made by Joe. But that my take on this is that you get to the chapter 8, where basically he reflects we need to work in these other registers, right? And he laid out that word that
that's where you see it the most.
Exactly, that's what he kind of pivot from the explanation of the global to something that is more complex, that speaks more to our possibilities into the world, right? So I would suggest that clearly there is more work to be done in that sense. But I think in the context of the range of the book,
he did
to be doing that on global level would be just impossible. Does that make sense? It's just too many variables and too many things. So
it was like, I mean, I think for me, I appreciated what he did, right? I mean, it's such the book is so expansive. And so, he kind of saved, I don't know if saved is the right word, but the discussions about gender, race, class, sexuality come in the audience section, right? In that last section of the book. And, and it could just be my particular reading lens, right? The lens through which I read scholarship, especially, given that it's predominantly around the telenovela genre, I kept wanting or expecting to address, to have the gender element be more. Those were the questions that kept popping up, because even in production, right? Like if we look at production, it's mostly male producers producing stories for a predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly female audience. And so I just kept, so in my head, and that's, obviously I'm reading, reading the book from the lens of a feminist scholar, and so, I wonder, and I'm not sure that incorporating or thinking through gender earlier in the book would have ultimately changed the analysis or the argument, the arguments and concepts he lays out. But I think it could have added a little bit more nuance, right, in terms of the dimensions of power.
No, you're absolutely right. I guess, but let me say this, because Joe, his research was first anchored in Brazil, right? So he's very knowledgeable about dynamics of race, class, gender in Latin America. But also, to be fair, one of the big discussions in Latin America about television or telenovelas, it was not the gender identity. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. Maybe it's bad in and of itself. But it was the power of the telenovela as a space where the everyday life happened and produced, based on a bigger reality of popular culture, a resistance from people that feel that they never had access to resources and they need to watch the novelas, and what is called by Martin Barbero the revenge of the poor. So you don't give me education, you don't give me access to theater, you don't give me access to literature, then I watch the novelas. And you know what I do? That I resist your idea that I need to be educated when actually you deny me that possibility. So in that sense, the novelas, even though you're right, they're problematic in terms of the representations. But in Latin American context, the value of them is more about the way that they can be appropriated, reused, resist from audiences. And I'm not saying even audience in the strict sense as something that is bigger, that is the popular culture. At this space where people talk to each other, feel their life, see their aspirations, reproduce hegemonic ideas and fought back this hegemonic idea through comedy, satire, and telenovelas sometimes became this space for that transformation. So telenovelas are a space of resistance, ironically, in the lowbrow consideration of resistance for people. That conversation in and of itself from Latin America is relevant. So clearly expanding the conversation in terms of the representations. But I would say the Latin American theoretical traditions basically has been more in this cultural expression of how the popular embrace, how this is mediated through spaces in in the La Plaza Pública, in La Bodega, in the Soper, in church, in the cemetery, and how these spaces and popular culture use television for that. I guess that's why the book in and of itself wasn't not really getting into representation or dynamics of race, class, or gender from the get-go. But you're right, it would be a really interesting look at issues of power and how the industry has been dominated from particular,
certainly somebody else can take up that project, right?
No, but I think this is a really interesting conversation because this really goes to the heart of the disciplinary and methodological issues. Basically what we talk about is do you start with the kind of political economy approach, or do you start with a more culturalist approach? And you're advocating for a more culturalist approach, which a lot of feminist scholars have argued for, whether in Latin America or other similar contexts. Whereas you're arguing for the kind of political economy as a kind of driving it, which I think Joe probably has contributed a lot to bringing those two together. And his first book, for example, his dissertation was about a political economy of the telenovela genre, but not just doing institutional work, but looking at audiences. But I do think, and I think Joe would be okay with me saying this because we have these conversations all the time, I do think that there is a certain limitation in the book and this debate, which is, do you start from a kind of more feminist perspective and say that when we talk about, let's say something like, the hybridization, do we start with the more kind of ground level realities? And then, so in other words, can chapter 8 be chapter 1?
Chapter 1.
Joe and I have these conversations all the time. And he's, very good about it, his game about, having and engaging with these questions. But I think it goes to that question of, do you start with a kind of a structuralist perspective on these? In fact, he says those are more determining than the cultural aspects. Whereas, I'm more of a culturalist.
I was just going to say, what's your opinion?
Yeah, so, I'm a more of a culturalist, and so I would start with the other way. And we have these conversations all the time. And but I think that goes to a much larger disciplinary question as well.
I'm really glad that you put the issue in those terms, because what I see in this is the fight or the convergence of different traditions. So I will distinguish cultural studies with a culturalist approach. So Latin American culturalist approach is not a cultural studies. It relates with cultural studies in some sense, but it's more about a broader social practices that I feel that cultural studies has left out. It's having so centered in audiences and representation that I feel that bigger questions in terms of sociality have been left out in this question. So Latin America has been centered in a culturalist element, that culture is at the center of what's going on in media. So that is the tradition from Latin America. So in the cultural studies tradition, I feel, you maybe agree or disagree with that, he was trying to explain you have either the text or either the audiences. Of course, there is a process of coding and decoding. There's a relation between audiences and texts. But he was trying to bring the audience, not necessarily the text in and of itself. I guess he wasn't really the text. But my feeling is that in this correlation between audiences from a cultural studies tradition and more political economy tradition with structure have really power, law, money, he really tried to bridge that. But my sense is that we tried to make that bridge, he ended up arriving to ideas of identity at the end of the book. As a result of that. But it would be difficult to start with that from the get-go, maybe, or maybe now he's prepared to that because he was able to go through the whole discussion first in this structure basis agency element, right?
I mean, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I was thinking quite possibly, because I had the same questions about gender really early on, and those kind of topics came towards the end. I was thinking more that when he addresses structure, then maybe there were moments where we can talk about gender, race, and class.
Absolutely.
And like when he talks about the relationship between developing and developed nations, and how he's critiquing, and rightfully so, he's critiquing media imperialism. And he mentions, Antonio Gramsci's hegemony. I thought that was a moment where we can talk about, okay, so who are the elites here within the nation? It's not just about
it's about gender and race and class,
and that then is very important to address, or it could be very important to address in terms of structure. And I thought that was a moment, instead of just flipping it, because I did agree with the structure in terms of like, let's address the larger structure in place, then we talk about the cultural aspects. But then maybe there's a moment where we can do a little bit of both.
Right.
Because I really feel that that's a very noble project to try to merge the two, and I think that's something that we need to continue doing.
Right.
So. Because you had mentioned encoding, decoding earlier, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what you think. So in encoding, decoding, you actually do precisely that, which is you make the production side also a question of cultural issues of, who are the producers, what is their gender, what is their race, what is their class standing, and that it is more fissured, on the production side as well. And so that the structure is fissured by culture is a insight that, you kind of glean in the earlier chapters, but it's only on the audience side that the race, ethnicity issues have become much more explicit. So it'd be very, like you said, it'd be very interesting.
What I feel that what's happening, at least in terms of Latin America, what you have is the elites of one region speaking and doing business with another, and I think because they both have this social and cultural capital, that they're able to sustain these forces and to have these industries and reinforce their dominance over their industries. And then also because of that, you have kind of the pushing out of ethnic media in those regions as well. I mean, that's talked about in Latinos Inc., where Latino-born, U.S.-born Latinos aren't allowed to or have access to media making. So I think maybe that could have been a moment where we can address, the cultural identity and how that influences structure.
But I guess some of the challenges is in the scope of this book to be able to make a case about issues of gender, issues of power, issues of race. The approach in many ways requires some anthropological, ethnographic sense. So to me it would be quite interesting, but at the same time we're talking about a project that talks about many industries around the world for many decades. So even though it's desirable, it was an impossible task in that moment because of the kind of data that you have access to. Only you do it from a perspective of I would say just the archive of the press. No, I don't know. Maybe there's
but the
something to be
scholarship's
discussed.
already there, right? Yeah. Like we have our, Arlene Davila's book. We have Yedi Rivera's work. Like we know there's already a scholarship about the political economy of these industries and the way that class in particular and access to educational capital and much of that training, of course, occurring outside of those countries, right? In the sort of, in the U.S. and other, at the time, centers of cultural production. And, we know, based on that scholarship, we know the role of gender, we know the role of class and education. So, I mean, I just, and it's not, and I think, I'm always mindful of like asking a scholar to do something that is not their project. And I don't think that's and I don't think that was the project of this book. And so that's, I'm not claiming that it should be the project of this book. I'm just saying that as I read the book, those were the questions for me. And perhaps, I think, given how productive the model he lays out is, there are questions that remain to be explored within this, especially in the context of Latin America. That I would hope that other scholars are tackling and take up. And I know that there are people that are tackling this, because I think it would just add further nuance to, it would continue to show the way that these concepts are productive and relevant in today's context.
You're absolutely right. I guess the interesting thing is I came to know Arlene Davila because of Joe.
Yeah.
He was the one that first said you need to read Latinos Inc. back in 2001 or back in 2002, right? But I guess maybe just a matter of priorities in that moment, in the second moment that he was taking on this project that is at global levels. And you're right in terms of the literature was there for the U.S., but not much for the world. So that kind of
but Yedi Rivero's work in Puerto Rico and Cuba.
But we're talking about the USA scholars, but not scholars out of the U.S. So that Yedi extraordinary work in the context of the USA Academy, but you go out of the U.S. it's a little bit more harder. I won't advocate more in this sense because I don't know actually the limitations that work had or not. Maybe just one thing at a time, maybe. But I agree with that. That dynamics of gender or racial is a very urgent matter to tackle, and I guess just in this moment he was really trying to come up with the idea, the tension between structural. It was, I guess, more back in those days, the big challenges, it was about people working the political economy. I remember being in these debates on the cultural studies. It was all about that huge debate, and everybody wanted to get it right, and all of them were critical thinkers. But in the debates, they seem to be enemies to that. They were, exactly. So
either one or the other. I remember those as well. I think we all do.
Are there any plans to make other editions, iterations of the book?
Like an update?
Yeah, because once I read it, I was like, this is a book that can be updated and used over and over again. And maybe that could be, some improvements, some ways that the book can go into different avenues in terms of like just the citation practices, looking at Latino media studies, because he obviously knows these things exist.
Right, he does.
He can just expand those areas even more so.
I do think, and that's one of the things I really liked about what he does. His citational practices, I thought, were people don't often think about that, but yes, I would have loved. So I would have loved to see more of the Latino media, Latino communication studies cited in this book. But I really respected the way he cited scholars working on Latin America and scholars from Latin America. Like, to me, that was so pedagogically important, and I think really speaks to his own politics as a scholar of wanting to bring to bring a visibility to Latin American scholars, and to ensure that he's citing emerging scholars in the U.S. and so I really like that.
And as the non-Latin Americanist here, I do think that one of the really key parts of this book, and of course it's about world television, and he's able to bring scholars writing about Asia,
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, as a non-Latin Americanist, what is your sense?
No, I think, the way he brings together work from South Asia, East Asia, he's had an ongoing conversation, for example, with Koichi Wabuchi's work on flows in East Asia, where, he has a similar kind of framing about culture and issues of proximity. So he's able to bring those kinds of issues into conversation in a very productive way. So, he's kind of cited work on South Asia. So like when I've talked about my work, I've mentioned, how it is translocal instead of talking about it as global. And so he sees parallels, and then he kind of talks about how we can think about, media in a global context in kind of translocal ways. And so I'm very, aware that Joe has a very strong, foundation in Latin America, and that comes through. But when you read the book, you also recognize that he's really aware of all these other, media and industries around the world, and he's able to put them in a very rich conversation, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, and that was one of that was the other sort of moment as I was reading through it. And again, this is today's context and not necessarily the context he was writing in. But when we think about kind of major media capitals today, India and Hong Kong, you know, are such big global players. I think, you know, it would have been interesting to hear. It would have been interesting to have him here and kind of, you know, think through those examples.
I guess he brings an idea that is something that he shares with John Sinclair. John Sinclair, as both of them have been working parallel in many projects, and somehow gives the relevance of the region. Right? He's very cognizant of the region, and he goes back in the book to try to see how the region has been impacted by colonialism in order to shed light in terms of social, cultural, racial dynamics, gender dynamics based on colonial times. That clearly Latin America is a good example of that kind of the seeds of colonialism in Latin America. So he's very cognizant of that, and he brings the idea of the region as this engine that can really break the power of the global in different contexts. So the region gives the possibility of particular centers to actually defy global powers because region matter, as the nation also matters. So in that sense, it's really interesting, the region and Latin America, but also East Asia, South Asia. And many scholars actually working along the lines of this idea from Iwabuchi, you said, right? In East Asia, and the relationship between Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong. And these other conversation about something that seems like cultural proximity, but ideas of modernity and spatial temporal times in the way that people live their lives and how they see other people live lives and how media reproduce that and allow particular shared experience or not. And in that sense, Japan and Korea is a really good example of that hierarchy of spatial temporal time that is brought by the question by the idea of geolinguistic market or cultural proximity by Joe with Iwabuchi. So he's basically laying the ground to work on that sense in other parts, not only in Latin America, that I found that really, really fruitful. And they laid out the idea of the media capital that it was developed by Michael Curtin, right?
So you bring like the geolinguistic region concept and his proximity concept, right? And if you put the two together, I think it's a very productive framework to analyze a lot of different regions around the world. And I think that's what he kind of sets up in the book, where he's saying, you know, if you can do this, this is how it looks in different parts of the world. So television as a medium that works, not just as television, but in these kind of very geolinguistic ways, which is for him like kind of structuration argument. But then it is not just the geolinguistic kind of logics of imperialism, colonialism, transnational capitalism, but that there are these cultural factors which for him come through the question of proximity. So for me, those two are, I think, his key kind of, you know, frames that he puts into conversation. And like you said, it can apply to almost, you know, any kind of geolinguistic region we can think of for television markets. So that is a very productive framework.
But I'm glad you said that because we can get also locked in the idea of the region as a cultural zone. But the idea that cities can be a hub for particular cultural vectors of movement or flows. For instance, immigration, connection with India and other parts of the world, for instance, that goes through capitals where the connection was not actually regional. It's another kind of connection, right? How Miami became a hub for Latin America. That is a connection that has to do with immigration, with flow of trade. So then he expanded the idea of, you have the expanded idea of how culture allow and moves allow to trace how maybe audiences, how industry flow with audiences in order to be grown. Well, in that sense, I just thought about that because I want to go back to the present moment. To what extent the digital moment breaks or not these logics that the industry have based on these cultural, regional, national, or immigration moves, right? These flows. To what extent, because I have the sense that students have this idea that they are free to the world. They can access everything. They feel this empowerment. But I am a little bit hesitant of that empowerment and of how their decisions are structured from culture, not only industrially, but it's culturally in terms of what is proximate to them and what kind of access do they have or the decisions do they make in order to show some things rather than the other, right?
Well, I think, you know, that's a great question. So in some sense, yes, audiences are empowered in ways that maybe were not available, certainly at the writing of this book, right? Like if you think about the adoption rates of smartphones, and what capabilities that allows people in terms of what media they can access and what media they can produce, right? So in that sense, it's true. They have a lot of agency in terms of knowing, in terms of what they choose to consume, how, when, right? And where, right? Where they want to consume it. And then, yes, it is, and I think this is, again, for me, where gender, race, and class become so important. The people doing the producing and the constraints around that, right? The people who have the power of production, who shape those messages, who decides what gets produced, who decides what gets distributed, remains a fairly homogenous group, and does really, I think rightly so, as Joe's work points out, really constrains and shapes what gets made. But, and this goes back to something at the beginning, the cost of production is so much lower now that I think that, in some sense, who has access to production and to producing text, has changed. And in that sense, I think we are living through a slightly different moment. And, I think, YouTube in particular and Vimeo and all these other formats, that do allow people a chance to produce their own text and, and gain visibility around it, gain audiences, gain followers, and maybe be picked up, right, by some of the big corporations. What happens to those texts when they get picked up is a different question, right? And then, but I do think that there are new players that are causing the big corporate players to have to adapt. To what extent, that's, so I do think, audiences, if you think about this, kind of generation of college students, in some sense, they do have agency in ways that audiences did not have before. That doesn't take away from the power of corporate media necessarily, but there are also non-corporate avenues that are open, even though those avenues are becoming corporatized too, right? Like YouTube is becoming corporatized,
Do you think that, in a sense, that gives almost audiences the false notion that there is equality in production, that because there's so much content out there, so many shows, web series, that now it's much more equal? That the producers of media are actually reflecting the representations that they're putting out there, which I don't believe is true. And the reason I think about this is because, I study media activism, and one of the ways that you mobilize groups of people is saying, hey, we're not being represented here. But you have, I think, a moment in which so much content is being made, and these producers of media are making that visibility, but it's still not reflected.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, this is, for me, especially in the U.S. context, you have this, it's not an incredible rate of visibility, but compared to zero, it's a lot, right? So compared to, zero visibility or even minimal visibility, 6-7%, 8% visibility looks like hyper visibility, right? And you feel this moment of like of transformation, right? Like, oh, there's got to have been an opening up, an increased opening up of access to people to tell their stories, and now we're seeing those stories on the screen. But when you look at the structures, that has not changed that much. And yeah, so I always, nervous about using false, that word per se, but, I do think, that the perception that somehow we have, things are changing because of the way the text looks, I think takes the pressure off the corporations, the corporate structures, the corporatized, media to actually transform and to democratize who gets to produce and tell those stories. But yeah, absolutely, I think that's I would agree with that assessment.
But I guess the flip side of it, though, is that, and this being the non-Latin Americanist here, I'll ask you, can you even talk about Latin America now as a kind of geolinguistic region, given the kind of deterritorialization you're speaking of through digital and the mobility that audiences and even producers are afforded as a result of being able to cross these borders fairly significantly now. I mean, not be dramatically, but important ways. And so then it kind of goes back to the book as well, just like we're talking about, if there was an update to this, would the geolinguistic region as a kind of fairly cohesive entity to structure the conversation still hold, or would you have to alter that geolinguistic to something else? Or even so you work on Cuba, right? So Cuba or Puerto Rico, do they contribute to this kind of geolinguistic cohesion, or are there other ways that we can conceptualize it?
Well, then the hegemony of Mexico too, right? And the way that countries within Latin America are pushing back, and even consumers are, pushing back on, on that as well. Yeah, absolutely right. Like, do we need to fragment, this behemoth of Latin America that's so expansive? And so diverse, and really, I think that's a good question.
So, would Cuba fit more in today with that, or less with that compared to the past, or given that it's kind of both politically, economically, kind of marginal, right? Because toward the end, he starts talking about the more peripheral kind of markets, right? So. It'd be really interesting. I mean, it is Latin America, but it is not in the corporate sense, right?
And I think if you're thinking about consumption, I think yes. Maybe people have, I guess the popular idea is that they're still isolated. However, there are avenues of getting some programs from the U.S. that are probably quicker than I could. And not everyone has that access. That access isn't equal. But in terms of consumption, I do think that there is a level of transnationalism that's there that most people wouldn't recognize. In terms of production, and the state still has television production under lock and key, and things have become more and more, I guess you could say, more neoliberal over the years, because they have to find ways to survive. But I guess maybe that's just the Cubanist inside me that feels like Cuba's always the one exception that's different from the rest of the world. But I think we would then have to figure out what paradigm works best there.
But even to go back to Yedi Riverdo's work, right? When she looks at the history of television and radio in Cuba, it was really set up by people educated outside of Cuba in the model of U.S. production. I mean, how it lives, how it actually is, lived and practiced today. I'm not sure, but I mean, the legacy, I'm assuming, has informed to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, of course she wrote Havana as the media capital for Latin America, and I think the technological structures that were put into place are still there. There's still a centralization of Havana in terms of media production, and to a certain degree, distribution practices as well. So no, you're absolutely right. I think they formed the structure very, very early on in the 50s, and with Havana as a media capital, and oddly, those flows, the hub that was Havana were the same flows that kind of brought those media professionals out, and then created Miami, as a new hub, as almost creating another media capital in that sense. It's just from Havana to Miami. So
Miami is really, you've written about it as well, right? Because now Miami is the capital of the geolinguistic region of Latin America. So
which is ironic.
And so that really contributes to the complication of all of this.
But that's kind of a very interesting point, right? So let me go back to Cuba, and then I go to Miami. So Cuba set up the conditions for Latin America to understand telenovela. So it was the Cuban that actually, from Cuba they went to Mexico, and then to Venezuela, to Brazil and Argentina, and ended up with the know-how, the Cuban that actually somehow structured the know-how to do things in Latin America. And then after the revolution, of course, the flag was took by Mexico, and then owned by Brazil and Venezuela, right? So it's interesting to see that in Joe's work that actually acknowledged this element that has to do with industrial dynamics of corporate and professional. And we're not talking about the corporation only, we're talking about the people that actually fled and allow many industries to grow with that kind of know-how and the impact that. Of course, that producing Cuba was in clear conversation with the US, right? The US was in clear conversations in terms of technology, culture, and that actually went on to the whole region, right? And then you have Miami, right? Miami has become this center of Latinidad and then connection with Latin America. But this is something really interesting because you're talking about the fighting back about the hegemonic position of the Mexican television industry. Miami has been fighting against the Mexican hegemony, and I'm not talking even about issues of Latinidad, issues of corporate power. Like the USA corporate power in Miami wants to take over Latin America, but they hasn't been able to do so for decades. So that's really interesting because it happened that the money of the US, the big corporation, Disney, Fox, they have failed to actually to fight back culture. And somehow the US is the example. That's kind of ironic, right? So culture matters at the end, for the wrong reason sometimes, because in this case, the Mexican watching telenovelas from Televisa for half of a century. That basically has locked the USA Hispanic market in watching Televisa's programming. That culture matters, but in this case, that kind of culture maybe is not that one that is desirable because it has a lot of problems in terms of hegemonic ideas of race, class, and gender, right? But the money was really trying for Miami, Telemundo had been fighting back against Univision since '87 with money from Sony or NBC. So the big money doesn't buy necessarily the possibility of audience to watch something. That to me is a really good example of pushback about any political economy simplistic way of thinking of if you have Disney, then you're going to be overripe. Right. Not that, money matters, but not everything. So in the case of Telemundo, you have the backing of NBC, and they've been actually kind of like testing ways of fighting back. And they're able to be successful until the 5 years from today. They, for the first time, were able to beat Univision in audiences ratings or audiences in VOD2 last year. And they had money since '97. It took 20 years with a lot of money put in that industry to take over Mexico. But that was things that really problematic. In 2017, for the first time since Telemundo was born, won over audiences over Univision in the 18 to 49 years market.
I was going to say that generation.
Yes. But how do they want that? Producing in Mexico. So the things get really complicated. Is Argos producing in Mexico narco novelas, with Mexican actors, but then this what I claim is the Rig Local template, what is money from the US, writers from Venezuela or Colombia, and producers in Mexico with actors in Mexico, with actors from the hemisphere, from very strategic places where audiences can see Venezuelanness, Colombianness, Hispanicness, Mexicanness. So they create this template that I call relocalization, that is not a production made not for the local, for the global, or vice versa, from the region to the region. Mm-hmm. So you produce something where different cities, different population take in a narrative with money from the US in this particular iteration, and they went over audiences for the first time here. And El Señor de los Cielos is the most wanted to see program in other markets all across the region in VOD, in the VOD market, right?
So I have a question, and this goes back to some of the discussion we were having about the term and the, and the role of, where they come from and what it means, and is it really a kind of a ground up term or push, kind of a top down term? So in the sort of Telemundo Mexican productions, are they keeping the cultural specificity of, like, when they're bringing in these actors from Colombia, from other parts of Latin America? Because that's often been the critique of Univision, right? That it's there's a blanqueamiento and also like a mexicanidad of like how people speak and the mannerisms and the accent. And so is Telemundo doing something different?
I'm glad you asked that, because Telemundo was trying to reign over the region by coming with neutral narratives and the idea that to erase anything anchored from the local. Right. Because the idea of Telemundo, of the universal, it was not to talk about the local because that may alienate other locals. So you kind of lower down the accent. You don't say which city this is modern, but it can be any city, Mexico City, Los Angeles. So, but that kind of a strategy that was used during the 2000s never really worked. What happened, they found that people really need to relate with what happened. Right. So the
that cultural proximity.
Exactly.
Right.
But that cultural proximity need to be made in a way that you don't alienate other people with particular. So what they did, and that's what I was claiming, is they, instead of erasing, they brought the locals with the accents, with the whole national, but from different places. Right. So you have this kind of a sprinkle of different places actually talking very Colombiano, very Mexicano, very everything.
Oh, that's interesting.
From different places, and then what you see is real people and real histories.
Wow.
And I talk about the Rig Local because it's this template where you have people from particular countries that are important in terms of television grammar, in terms of visibility. For the USA Hispanic market, by the way. Yeah. And then you make those histories in this particular sense has been the narco narratives that they transform into the super series, where basically flows of immigration, crime, people, all these things are part of this male-oriented new genre that actually, but spoke with what is the multi-local that are defined by the region, right? So instead of, because they thought the neutral is going to be the universal. No, the universal is the local. It's the everyday life that people can see. The local not understood as the national, but the local, the everyday of people. Mm-hmm. So what I think that this new model tried is different locals united about a particular narrative, right? Yeah. And then people see themselves. So then you cannot. This is for market reasons. You cannot avoid the Mexicanness because of the amount of Mexicans, right? So, but you need to add a different Latinidad, right? So you have the Mexicanness, but you have Colombianness, Venezuelanness, Hispanicness, USA Latinos. Immigrant stories are really powerful too.
But that's and that's actually the lived experiences of most Latinos in the U.S. Right? They're living in these, in, whether it's California or New York. You're living in much, Latinos are are diverse, and they're, you know, that's their experience. Like, you know, you're in California, you know, there's a huge Central American population. So it's not, you know, like, it's not about just living in a space where all you hear is Mexican Spanish,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And the same in New York, and the same in Miami. And so, you know, I can see why that would be a compelling strategy, you know?
We should probably wrap up, right? So,
Yeah.
are we
Oh,
done?
Yeah.
Everyone looked to me for the first time. There's someone behind the camera.
Okay.
So maybe just a mode of conclusion. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
A mode of conclusion.
I don't know how we want to enter that, or if we even want to, maybe.
I just had one comment about this conversation, which is, I think what you've explained really is a very nice update to the geolinguistic region argument, because what you've explained is a kind of multi-local geolinguistic region, right? That it is still geolinguistic and has all these commonalities that Joe nicely maps out. But then you're saying that it has become more complicated because there are these multi-local casts, multi-local kind of production centers, all contributing to the creation of something really new, which defies the kind of labels that we've kind of, you know, been used to.
But I guess my argument was, for this case, because as USA Latinos, we see this very particular dynamic happening. I see the discussion between the local and the global all the time being displayed between this. There is no iteration of the region in that discussion.
Right.
It's always you're the local,
Right,
or you're localized, or you're globalized,
Globalized,
or exactly.
Globalized, yeah.
And say, what is the region? And it happens that the USA Latino population, that is a very particular population in world terms, requires the region. So the region is key here. So imagine, and the thing is that the fact that the Hispanic market wanted to reign over the region and the global, they needed to create something that is not only the local and the global, the region matter. Of course, this is an industrial construction. Let me just put that in underscore. This is a fabrication.
Corporate
of-
fabrication.
Exactly, a fabrication of that cultural proximity at regional level. Does that make sense? That happened, that is working for them now.
Well, I'm trying to think in terms of wrap up.
I actually had a question. Maybe we can
Yeah.
wrap up with this. What do you think? What's the utility of the book in terms of teaching?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Like what way? Because as I was reading, I was thinking, okay, obviously world television course, but what other courses could we possibly use to teach with the book?
I mean, for me, you know, I will assign it in just U.S. Latino media class. I mean, I think it's really important for thinking about the relationship of, you know, what happens in the U.S., how it shapes and is shaped by what happens in Latin America. I think it's, you know, it's such a solidly researched book that I think it's really instructive in that way, as kind of a background to understanding that we can't just think about media in the context of the U.S. or even the national, you know, as you were saying. I don't know.
I think, you know, definitely a world television course, a global media class, but also I think, you know, kind of methodological classes.
Methodological.
Where, you know, Joe is a very methodologically oriented person where, you know, he likes to do his ethnographies, you know, in-depth kind of analysis of industrial data. And you can see how, you know, that kind of gets worked through in all these multiple levels that he wants to map out. So, yeah, I mean, I think a methodology class on even like political economy and cultural studies and debates on those, I think this would be a very useful class. Book for a class like that.
Well, I have used a class in transnational media, close class, that pretty much speaks. I mean, I have a global class too, but the international media class allowed me to go away from the totalizing idea of global powers and how there are other powers that are fighting back. So to what extent this idea of structuration that people can do with their own resources, whatever they can actually produce, come up with something, is very important to say how local, national, or regional industries can overcome the overpowering presence of the US or Japanese or British media, right? We don't deny their presence, but they are not the only players here and not necessarily the most watched. They are there. And particular layers of, particular groups of people watch them, but there are many others that are looking at something that is more near to them. And that sense, I guess the book layout very interesting. These different proximities that are industrial, are cultural, are from genre, and from different layers of possibilities.
Well, thank you to the caucus for letting us have this conversation in this space.
Wonderful. And what I'm planning on doing is actually probably sending Joe all of the conversation that we've recorded.
Yeah.
So why don't we all say hi to Joe?
Hi, Joe.
Hi,
Hope
Joe.
you're enjoying your time in Pakistan.
Yeah,
You could be here.
You're doing great.
Yeah.
Hope you're doing some good cultural proximity discussion in Pakistan.
You were missed.